welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus with Bob Mendelsohn.
Exodus chapter 17. A couple stories that are fairly familiar to us. Something about water, something about grumbling, and something about a guy named Amalek. And Moses getting tired and a couple boys helping him. Familiar stories? You know a couple of these. You know a little bit of the scene. Let's unpack it and see lots more stuff about how good God is and what He wants to demonstrate of Himself, which is what? I am with you. This is probably the great theme of Exodus, if there is just one. I'm with you, I heard you, I'll deliver you, I'll be with you in the wilderness, build this tabernacle that I may be with you. The presence of Yahweh is maybe the bigger theme than any other theme in the book of Exodus. I used to think it was about redemption, and that would be the theme. But there's so much more. The Mishkan takes up 15 chapters of the book. The Ten Commandments takes up. What does that have to do with redemption? No. It's really that God wants to be present with us. And that, I think, is the more major theme. Of course, we use the word Exodus to be the theme of the book, because that's the way the Latin works. Shemot. And that, of course, names. And it's just the listing of the names of the people who are there at the beginning of the book, who came into the land. Kind of random how names are chosen. Chapter 17, verse 1, all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin. Remember, one of the 5 names for this same section of turf. According to the command of the Lord, really the mouth of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. This was one of the places that you'd be looking maybe for an oasis. This is one of the places where you'd think Moses, as shepherd, who had worked out there in that section of the world, would know where to take the people. But he apparently didn't. That's the way the human understanding might be. But how did the people get from the wilderness of Sin to Rephidim? By foot. And why did they choose that route? They're following a cloud. So it wasn't Moses' problem. He's not a one lacking guidance. Remember, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. So sometimes people say Moses got lost. Remember that if Moses would have been a woman, she would have stopped and asked for directions, and she would have gotten to the promised land in 14 days, because that's all it takes to cross from Egypt over to Israel. But it wasn't Moses that led them. It was God that led them. And you always have to remember that. So He takes them to a place where there's no water. Now, why would He do that?
He wants to see if they will call on Him.
That's it. And not be angry at Him, but call on Him. Now, why would they do that? Why would they call on Him? Because 2 chapters earlier, He just provided for them water to drink. 2 marvelous methods, one with that tree in the lake and the other with just, here came water. So He's already answered. He's sort of like in law when you're at the courtroom and the defendant is being asked a question and the attorney for the other side raises up and says, asked and answered. You've already asked that. You've already seen it answered. Why are you doing this again? Verse 2, therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? There's an intimate relationship between Moses and God. And whenever the people are mad at Moses, really, he's saying, you're mad at God. Why are you bothering me? Now, maybe because he's a new leader, he says that. It's really not a good advice to tell the people, what are you bothering me for? Go talk to God. Because really, you stand in the place of God, Moish. You're there. You rep God. You're His agent. You're going to take the blessing, you're going to take your curses. Here's some bothers. Liabilities and assets. Why do you test the Lord? That's really a good question. Why do you Massah the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water. Now, in our day, we use the phrase, I'm starving. And kids use the phrase, I'm starving. When you're a teenager and you haven't eaten for an hour, you're starving. And you got home and you had a banana, and then an hour later, I'm starving, when's dinner? Well, you're not really starving. And these people may have been a wee bit thirsty, but now they're growing in thirst. So I get that. And now they loon, they grumble against Moses and say, why now have you brought us up from Egypt? Why is this? It's an odd phrase, really. What is this? Massah. What is this? Have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So, are they serious? This is ridiculous. You've been delivered at the Red Sea. Now, we don't know how long this is. We don't know if this is a month later, 5 months later, a week later, an hour later. The time is not recorded.
I thought it was a repetition of what happened before.
It sounds just like it.
Sounds like it.
And if it sounds just like it, what is your reaction as the leader?
They saw salvation with water in the beginning. Why can't they just trust the Lord to
Excellent.
water?
The whole point is trust the presence of God. If there really is a God, and He's already delivered you, He's heard you, He wants to be present with you, He's given you the cloud and the fire and by day and the night, He's walking with you, He's assured you already, you've watched the horse and rider thrown into the sea. Relax. Not relax in the sense of she'll be right, mate, but God will be right, mate. God will be with us. And that is something. I've been walking with the Lord 40 years, and I've seen His hand way too often. I don't deserve it any time, and He keeps showing His majesty again and again. And yet, I still say, I wonder, will He really come through? I wonder, will He really demonstrate Himself? Will He really show up? Now, I know better, but these thoughts definitely splash around in my head.
Yes.
The reality is we're not there yet, and we're not walking like with each other. I can see you, I can put my arm on your back, we can hang out, we can have a sandwich together. This is real. I've seen you. But Yeshua, I've read about. Yeshua, I've talked to. Yeshua, I've believed in. But I've never really hung out with Him in that same carnal, read that in a good way. So doubts are natural. And God, who is this ever-present one, has to again and again demonstrate Himself to a people so that they grow used to trusting Him. I think that's why He led them to Rephidim, so that they would have waterlessness, so that they would learn to trust Him. That's a beautiful thing about God. We read these passages and say, you idiot Jews, what's wrong with you? That's our people. That's who we are. This is us. Some people read it and say, what's wrong with them? Why wouldn't they? Because we would do the same thing. We've had a developed sense of faith, me for 4 decades, others for longer, others for shorter. But the whole point is that we've got strength in our faith body, if you will, based on the practice of God's test and our understanding of it and our passing those tests. In 1 Corinthians 10, the apostle says, no temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man. And He will, with that temptation, give you a way of escape. There's this idea that spiritual muscles are developed. And our life with God, He doesn't start us off in year 4. He starts us off in pre-K. And we grow in this. But He doesn't start us in uni. He starts us much earlier. So we have to grow and develop. He doesn't hand us a baton and say, go out there and win that leg of the 400 meters. He says, let's learn to crawl. So God leading us to Rephidim is designed to get us through the grumbling to the faith. Does that make sense? And without that, you're going to be aggro the Jewish people. Don't do that, because it's all about developing who we are with God. So Moses cries out and says in verse 4, what am I supposed to do? I'm an 80-year-old guy. I've already done this water trick thing. What do you want? They're about to sack me. Really, the Hebrew is sakal. They're about to stone me. And the Lord said, okay, here, pass before the people, take with you some of the elders. So now it's not you alone doing a trick. Now I want to get it community-based. And take in your hand your staff. This will be a very famous staff. We've already seen it in operation at the Red Sea. Now we're going to see it again and again. With which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I'll stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. God is going to stand on a rock. How weird is that? Is that a normal phrase? No. I will go with you. Okay. But I'm going to go stand on a rock at Horeb, and you'll strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. Moses did so in the sight of the elders, whom he took with him, of Israel. So he named the place Massah and Meribah.
That's where the Psalms come from.
Yeah, Psalm 95.
Mentions Massah and Meribah.
Yeah, we're going to go there. And this is the natural effect of the grumbling. This is what often happens. These are real places, Massah and Meribah. Massah meaning testing, Meribah meaning dissatisfaction, which is actually backwards. It should have been dissatisfaction and then testing. When you think about it, I want you to get this, that it's God who is testing them, and their dissatisfaction is a result of the test. I just want you to see that it's not human only, that God is involved in that by leading them there. This is key. So God answers the problem now a third way, a different way than he's done it before. The first two times we already looked at in chapter 15, and now chapter 17 we see him doing a water thing again. And it's a beauty. He named the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarrel, and that's the word quarrel, reeve, meaning is the root of the dissatisfaction. So some translated quarrels of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? What's the answer to that? Is the Lord among us or not? Yes. And the answer is yeah, this is exactly it. So now, as Ezra said, we have to go to Psalm 95. And you'll see this phrase, it's O come, L'chuna Ranana. I'm sure that when King David wrote this 1,000 years before Yeshua, that it was a different tune altogether. Psalm 95, O come, let's sing for joy to the Lord, let's shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. We'll shout, we'll sing, he's a great king. The sea is his, all his hand. Come, let's worship, verse 6, and bow down, kneel before the Lord our Maker, verse 7, he's our God, we're the people. Then verse 7, it's an aggravation that God demonstrates because of our failure at this point. Today, if you would hear his voice, of course, King David is writing this in Psalm 95, so about 500 years after the episode at the Red Sea and at Massah itself, 500 years later. So he's writing about an episode 500 years old. He's writing then, and he's writing about a future as well. So King David is multitasking. Today, if you'd hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as at Meribah. So he's saying to the people in Israel, 1000 BC, today, right now, while King David's playing the lyre or the lute or the harp or something, he's saying, don't harden your hearts. Like you did, actually your fathers did. They tried me, though they'd seen my work. 40 years I hated that generation. So this is a prophetic reminder from history about something 500 years old, saying, well, don't do the same thing. Okay? Now look one more at the book of Hebrews, chapter 3. It goes into 4. And you can see in chapter 3 of the book of Hebrews, it says, therefore, verse 7, just as the Holy Spirit says, see, not even King David, this is the Holy Spirit saying, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts as when they provoked me in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they didn't know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care, brethren, verse 12, that there not be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. So this idea of the testing at Massah and Meribah, it is an action that took place under Moses. It's an action that is reminded under King David, and it's an action that's reminded under the writer of Hebrews, that it's all about God and confidence in him. That we don't have evil, unbelieving heart. It's interesting that evil in the writer of Hebrews is always about faithlessness. That's the definition. But what does he say? Hebrews 3:13, encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today. So it's not today. It was really future to King David and seriously future to Moses, but the writer of Hebrews says that today is today. Today, we're going to remember what they wrote back then, and to this today, don't harden your hearts today like they did back then. Why? What's going to happen? Because if you get in on this, you will have not an evil, unbelieving heart, but you'll have rest. That's what he's promising us. a Sabbath that is eternal, day after day, as long as it's called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. What's sin to the writer of Hebrews?
Disobedience.
Yes, but even easier than that, unbelief. That's the sin.
Untrusting unbelief.
Yeah, it's unbelief that is sin. That is, if you want to sin, you'll be unbelieving. If you want to walk with God, you'll be believing. So he says, I don't want that unbelief to be in you. I want you to believe. But what are we supposed to believe? It's not just this notion of faith. It doesn't matter what you believe. Just believe in the Sydney Swans, or just believe in, Tony Abbott, or just believe in Abbott and Costello. I mean, what are we supposed to believe in? Does it matter what we believe in? Well, yeah. And so he's saying, if you hear His voice, it's particular. It's all about relationship with God. If you hear His voice, don't harden your hearts. When they provoked me, Hebrews 3:16, who provoked Him when they'd heard? Didn't all those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was He angry for 4 decades? Those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness. Whom did He swear they wouldn't enter His rest? But to those who were disobedient. So they were not able to enter because of unbelief. Therefore, chapter 4, verse 1 of Hebrews, let us fear. So this whole thing about the meeting at the Rephidim, we can learn from. It is a direct biblical application. And I like that. Sometimes we draw applications. You know that. We read a text and we say, oh, this means I should never go to the Shire. Or we read this and it means, oh, I shouldn't date, Susie. Or I read this and it means that America is going to go to hell in a basket because of what they're saying to Israel today. I mean, whatever. Those are applications that you can draw. But this is an interpretation that the Bible gives us from the text tonight. Therefore, let us fear, if while a promise remains of entering His rest, any of you may seem to have come short of it. So you get the good news. The word is preached, and they didn't gain by it. Why? Because, verse 2, it was not united by faith in those who heard. We who believed enter that rest. So this idea of faith is a result of word. That is, God speaks, we believe, and that settles it. So he says there's even more promises, and he fixes a day. Look at verse 7, Hebrews 4:7. He again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David, after so long a time, just as had been said before, if you hear His voice, don't harden your hearts. For if Yeshua had given them rest, Yehoshua had given them rest, He would not have spoken of another day after that. So this idea of the culmination of days, and it's really a sabbatical thing that he's talking about, then He wouldn't have spoken of another day after that. So it's today. Why is today so important? It's today because if you don't respond today, there won't be a good tomorrow for you. And don't say, well, I used to do well. Yesterday was pretty good. He says, yeah, but where are you today?
So every day should be a Sabbath rest?
Living in the rest of God. And that's certainly the theme here in the book of Hebrews, that we've entered into it because of faith in Yeshua. There is something yet ahead that He promises, and that's this eternal Sabbath that is characterized by or anticipated by the Garden of Eden. And that would have been good, but we fell, didn't get to experience it. So He promised something like that in the future. There remains, chapter 4, verse 9, a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who's entered His rest has himself also rested from his work as God did. Therefore, I love verse 11. It's one of the most confusing things you could ever read. What does it say in ours? Let us be diligent to enter that rest. Be diligent to enter the rest. What's the King James on that? Strive to enter that rest. How do you strive and rest at the same time? Striving sounds like a struggle.
Because it's a choice. It's not something that's automatically going to happen. Sometimes even turning your phone off or whatever it is that you're doing, even in your quiet time daily, not the Sabbath, is a choice. You're choosing to do that.
Yeah, we're definitely swimming upstream in this idea of finding God and finding peace with God. And what's it about? It's about faith in God, personal faith, and not falling from the same example of disobedience. Why? How? For the Word of God is alive, active, and sharper than any two-edged sword. So if we trust in what God said, if we hear His voice, we will win. That's obviously what the passage is saying. And this whole business of today and hearing His voice is great. This idea of struggling is something that the Apostle Paul picks up. We can see it in his letters to the Colossians. I'll just show you one verse in that, and that might be useful to you. Colossians chapters 1 and 2. At the end of chapter 1 in Colossians, we see this. Chapter 1, verse 28, we proclaim Him, admonishing every man and teaching every man with all wisdom, so that we may present every man complete in Messiah. For this purpose also I labor, toil, grow tired, be weary, striving, second word, according to His dunamis power, 129, which mightily or powerfully works, energeo, within me. Look how many verbs there are in that, or words that have the strength and might and power and work. I mean, this is His labor that He says, kopao. And what does He then say? Chapter 2, verse 1, I want you to know how great a struggle, agonizing, I have on your behalf, and for those who are at Laodicea, and for all who have not personally seen my face, that their hearts may be encouraged. So this idea of striving to enter rest is that same idea. I'm going to work hard, I'm going to agonize, I'm going to give myself that I can rest. It doesn't mean I'm going to exhaust myself and then fall on my bed and not be able to get up for 14 hours. It means I'm going to do everything I can to live in faith and battle myself and battle the ways of the world and battle anything that stands against the purpose of God. That's the idea of this battle that the Apostle Paul had on behalf of the Colossians. That's what we need to do on behalf of ourselves, really, if that makes sense. Back to Exodus. That was a little Exodus ourselves from the text, but I thought you should see it in context. And that's the message of Massah and Meribah. And the second story in tonight's passage, starting in verse 8 of Exodus 17, is that Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim.
You say that because of the lack of faith, God sent Amalek to fight with them?
Is one causative? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Why God chooses to send things when He sends them? We don't know. We don't know. We just have to keep trusting Him. Why did He not send Amalek earlier? Or why didn't He send him 10 years later? We don't know. Who was Amalek? He's actually a descendant of Esau, Jacob's brother. And so Amalek, Esau's remnant, if you will. There's always these fellows around like Ammon and Moab who were children of Lot. And there's all these folks who still have their residences, their South 40, somewhat near. So Amalek, another wanderer, came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, who's now a good helper, choose men for us and go out and fight against him. Tomorrow I will station myself on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Where do you reckon he is? Well, what does it say? Next verse. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed, but when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him. And he sat on it. Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on the one side, one on the other, and his hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek. How do you like that one? He chalashed him and his people with the edge of the sword. Now, what was the last thing I saw sitting on a rock? God Himself. So Moses says, I'm going to go sit on a rock because I just saw God do it and we got water. Maybe if I go sit on a rock, maybe we'll win a battle against Amalek. And sure enough, that's what happened.
He must have been tired.
Well, he was an 80-year-old guy. But Aaron is 3 years his senior. How come he's not tired? We don't know why. But what we do know is that Joshua, the captain, the general, if you will, goes out and he's fighting against Amalek with a bunch of guys. He took some men. We don't know how many men, it doesn't say, but however many it was enough to rout them. What a strange military method. When Moses holds his hands up, we win. When he drops his hands, we lose. What does that mean? You could look and say, well, the people were watching, and if his hands were up, they went out and chased out the Amalekites. But when Moses put his hands down, must be rest time. Like a conductor at an orchestra. His hands were up. Well, how do you get someone's hands up if you are standing next to them? So here's Moses sitting on the rock. Here's Aaron on one side, Hur on the other side, holding his hands up. How do they do that unless their hands are up? In some measure, right? Or that they're very tall. They supported his hands, verse 12.
They have to have faith too.
That's it. That's really it. I mean, they could look and say, listen, Moish, this is not a really good battle strategy.
Yeah.
Why don't we send down about 400 other guys? We got plenty of people. These Amalekites are not so epis. Why don't we do this? But they took hold. They upheld the word grasp. It's all of those words in the Hebrew tamach. They supported his hands, one on one side, one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until the sun was set. So it must have been hours. I mean, we don't know how long. They didn't go out at 6 a.m. or 4 a.m. We don't know when they went out. But somehow it was a good long time that they were holding up his hands. And Joshua, as we see, overwhelmed Amalek. But the Hebrew word? Chalash, which means to lie prostrate. So Joshua made Amalek lie prostrate, overwhelmed him, conquered him, and his people with the edge of the sword. This idea of putting your foot on the neck of the conquered might be in view here. It's pretty remarkable. Moses' hands were heavy. I want to look at a verse. Matthew chapter 26. Yeshua is doing some pretty significant things, and then he has Pesach together with the boys and probably some other people in verse 20. And he says, verse 23, whoever dipped his hand with me in the bowl, whether that's parsley or whether it's chlorosis or moror, probably moror. He says in verse 28, this is the blood of the covenant poured out for many for forgiveness of sins. So he institutes his supper. Verse 30, after singing a hymn, they went to the Mount of Olives. So that's what you do at the end of a Seder. And he says, some of you will fall away. And Peter said, I don't think so. Maybe the others are going to, but I'm not going to, because I will never fall away. What a boast. In a way, it's faith. Really, you got to love Peter. He's saying, I've seen a lot of stuff, and I've been a fisherman, and I've knocked you back. Look, I'm sorry, but I'm really hanging with you. I'm here for the long haul. Yeshua says in 34, well, I say to you for sure this, that this very night, before a rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. He said, well, maybe the others, but I won't deny you. And what does it say, 35? All the disciples said the same thing too. So we've always picked on Peter, but really all the guys said, yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. And so they didn't really believe it. It's like saying, no, Lord. If he's Lord, don't say no. So what does it say in verse 36? This is key. Yeshua came with them to a place called Gethsemane, said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and distressed. So he's taking on board what? All the sins of the world. He's taking the pain, the punishment, he's getting it all. It's wrapping itself around him like the seaweeds around Jonah's head. And he went a little beyond them, fell on his face and prayed, Father, if it's possible. What does he say to them in verse 38? My soul is deeply grieved, boys, to the point of death. You guys remain here. Keep watch with me. I've got a battle coming. I'm going to go do what I need to do. I'm the Joshua in the story. You guys be Moses. One of you be Moses, one of you be Aaron, one of you be Hur. You got 3 of you. You guys go and help me because I'm going to battle. You with me? He went a little beyond them, verse 39, fell on his face and prayed, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Not as I will, but as you will. He came back, verse 40, to the disciples and found them sleeping.
Because of the wine they drank.
That's right. 4 cups of wine will knock you out. He said to Peter, so you could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying. So he gives them a chance again, right? To not enter into temptation. The spirit's willing, flesh is weak. He went away a second time, verse 42, and prayed, Father, if this can't pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. Verse 43, what happens? He comes back and he finds them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. What was Moses' arm problem?
Heavy.
They were heavy. So the same temptation, if you will, that fell on Moses was accomplished or beaten by Aaron and Hur. Peter, James, and John should have learned from that episode. Didn't, and all 3 of them started snoring. He left, went away a 3rd time, saying the same thing once more, and he came to the disciples and said, are you still sleeping and resting? He's given up on them now. As far as their being the support team, he knows he's all alone. Joshua was not all alone in the episode with Amalek, but Yeshua went to the cross all alone. Pretty remarkable. Let's go back to Amalek and look at the end, verse 14 to 16. Midor, Dor, You want to hear Midor Lidor, but there's no L. This is Amalek. He's going to be the cursed one. And I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek. Well, we know he is the descendant of Esau. What else do we know him? One of his descendants, Gog. Amen. That's right. So we've got this long line of troublemakers. Agag, who gets King Saul in trouble, really. It's Saul who gets Saul in trouble by not destroying Agag, who was an Amalekite, and it would have utterly blotted him out. That would have been a fulfillment of prophecy. And then Haman, who we know, who is the Purim story with Esther and Mordecai, and Haman was an Amalekite. It's a painful reality when we think about what's going on today in the land of Israel, and the pain that is to our people and to the global. Well, look at everything in the world right now focusing on Israel. It is terrible. Children being used and abused. Both sides doing some wrong things. Both sides feeling justified. You know, it's sort of like you lean into me and I'm bothered and I pull out a .357 Magnum and shoot you in the head. You know, but I feel justified because really it's you who bumped into me. There is bumping by both sides. When we send Australia troops to World War II or to Vietnam, did any Australian do anything wrong? Of course they did. They're sinners and they're going to do wrong. Both sides have done wrong. It's not the first episode. The 3 boys who were killed was not the first episode. We are Jews. We know how it is to be victims. We've lived with a victim mentality for generations. So when we see a person in Gaza saying that they're a victim, we say, no, you're not. Well, if the Gentiles do that to us, you're not a victim. We say, well, yes, we are. You need to understand. There's a whole business of understanding that we don't do because we seem to think that no matter what anybody else does, our boys never do anything wrong. Our girls never do anything wrong. We are a judgeable people. And the reality is that everybody's done something that aggravates someone else. We may not say that's a justified reality, but we are not the judges. So we can't say that all the Arabs are wrong. We can't say that all the Jews are wrong. We can't say anything about that because we're not the judge. We're going to talk a lot about this at the One New Man gathering in a couple weeks because it is such a hotbed topic. We're going to talk about Christ at the checkpoint. We're going to talk about some other things that are really hot topics both in the community of faith and not. So Amalek, the point was this. Amalek was trouble to the Jews. Esau was trouble to his brother. And God had a plan to eradicate the problem by utterly destroying Amalek. But every time we got close to eradicating them all, a little persists, and that little persists and grows, and it's an annoyance.
What about Hitler? Do you think he's an Amalekite too?
No, he was an Austrian. He had the spirit of Amalek, that's for sure. And that's why the Apostle John calls it the spirit of Antichrist who's gone into the world. There are lots of them, he says. Yeah, anti-Messiah, so that people who are opposed to the plan of God and to the Messiah that he gave. All that to say, there are times when if we just comply with God and bring justice to a thing, it really will help the future. It will end things or begin things or appropriate things. We'll do the right thing. It'll be much better. But if we don't do the right thing, we not only are mucking things up for ourselves, but for the future. And that's not healthy for anybody. So when God has a plan today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Don't mess around. Do what God says. The penultimate verse. What does it say? Adonai Nisi. The Lord is my banner. That's kind of neat. What do you fly at the end of a triumph? When you flatten the other guys. You know, you fly your flag. So he says here, you got a flag? Make it a God flag. Don't put up an Israel flag. Don't put up a Moses is our hero flag. Don't get t-shirts that say, Joshua, I love you. But right up there that God's my banner. Yahweh. So that's Exodus 17, and it's a good lead-in to what's going to happen with Jethro.
You've been listening to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus in Australia. For more information, contact Jews for Jesus, Post Office Box 925, Sydney, Australia 2001. God bless you.